It's a fire. You can see what's going on behind me. It's autumn winter burning off of all the dead material. Quite spectacular, isn't it? Well, today I want to talk about the role hate speech plays in violence. Not just interpersonal violence, not just intercommunity violence, not just violence during a civil war, but what happens when the state uses hate speech to target a minority. Now, hate speech is a simple concept. It's when you denigrate, abuse somebody because of a particular characteristic. Not because of who they are, what they've done, what they're going to do, but because of a particular characteristic, because of their race, their gender, their sexual orientation. That's the issue. And the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which is currently going on, highlights the role that hate speech plays. And if you look at every major genocide, every major war that has occurred in the history of humanity, hate speech precedes that violence. And what we've seen in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it is a conflict, quite a vicious conflict, what we've seen is what happens when the state promotes hate speech to divide communities. It's not just what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank, but what's happening in Palestinian Jewish Arab communities within the state of Israel itself. So what we see, like this fire behind us, the fire is indiscriminate. Indiscriminate. Doesn't matter what was on that pile, whether it was green, whatever it was, it's burning. And it's the same with hate speech. Hate speech is indiscriminate in terms of the damage it does to the people that are targeted. We've seen hate speech being used in this country as far as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are concerned, as far as refugees are concerned, as far as asylum seekers are concerned. And it's no accident that the refugees and asylum seekers who were offshored, the government did all it could to deny us their personal stories, because in order to create the conditions that hate, you need to be able to dehumanise the other. The Arab is the enemy, the Jew is the enemy, the lesbian is the enemy, the gay is the enemy, the transsexual is the enemy, the black is the enemy. And if you look at human history and the history of wars, preceding each war, preceding each conflict, preceding each violent interaction in a community against a minority, hate speech has been the lubricant. It is the petrol that's poured on the fire. It is what creates the conditions in people's minds to think of the other as a disposable commodity, not as a human being with needs and wants and desires, but as a disposable commodity. We saw it during the Armenian genocide. We saw it during the Holocaust, during the World War II. We saw it in the 60s and 70s and 80s in Australia during the gay bashing epidemic that occurred in this country. We saw it during the colonisation process, which we continue in this country today. We see it every day, and it's no accident. In the membership criteria of public interest before corporate interest, we clearly state membership is open to people of all religious beliefs and no religious beliefs. Membership is open to all nationalities and races and genders and sexual orientation. Because once we start as a community to point at the other, we have issues. We saw these issues when the Rohingya were driven out of Myanmar. We see these issues playing out in Palestine and Israel as I speak. We see these issues playing out in this country as far as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are concerned. And we see these issues playing out continuously. But when it moves from an interpersonal issue to the fact that the state takes up the hate speech, where all the instruments of the states and the private sector are used to marginalise and ostracise and dehumanise a minority, then we see the atrocities that occurred over history. I'm not just talking about atrocities thousands of years ago. I'm talking about the atrocities in Rwanda around 20 years ago, when the slaughter of the Tutsis was preceded by a campaign of hate speech in the local media, in the radio especially. We see it in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is raging, where we've seen for years ultranationalists and nationalists, Jewish nationalists and ultranationalists, hiding behind the state of Israel, promote hate of the Arab. Not because of individual, but because of the Arab. And we've seen different factions within the Israeli state government, within the Israeli government, fight amongst themselves, have an auction about who can create the most hateful situation. And when the state, the power which is innate in the state, is combined with hate speech, we then have the environment for evil on a massive scale. And we saw that during World War II. We saw that during the Holocaust. We've seen that during the Rohingya expulsion just a few years ago. We've seen it currently in Palestine and Israel. We see it in many places around the world. We see that growing tide of hate and intolerance growing in our own country, where we have organisations which are attempting to gain political advantage by using hate as their motivation. Hate is based on the people's fear of losing their jobs, fear of being ostracised in their own country. And we are seeing the growth of hate and hate speech as a fundamental political tool that is used not just by minorities in this country, but by governments. And governments continue to use hate and fear as a motivating force. As we approach the next federal election, I think it's important to understand that hate speech is not just the type of stuff you hear from white supremacists or black nationalists or, ideological people, directed people. But hate comes in many forms. In this country, we have a concept which is called dog whistling. And every time there is a federal election, the Liberal National Party dog whistles. It's fear. And we call it dog whistling because it's a whistle that can only be heard by the racists in the community, by the bigots in the community. It is that call to arms to support a government which is willing to use its legislative power in order to maintain those inequalities. And dog whistling is a fundamental aspect of any federal election in this country. Let's not forget, the first legislation that went through the Australian Parliament in 1901, when this country was federated, was the White Australia policy. Let's not forget that this country has some of the most extreme policies towards asylum seekers and refugees. Let's not forget that this country refuses to enter into meaningful negotiations with this nation's First Nations people. And it took decades for the Prime Minister, not the government of the day, but the Prime Minister, Mr. Rudd, to issue an apology for the stolen generations who are the victims of government policy to remove part Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders from their families so they could be reintegrated and assimilated into white Australia. Things have not changed that much. And as we see, this fire behind us has now died down. The embers are still there. The embers of hatred are still there. But the fire has died down. And the fire dies down when people like you and me, political parties or organisations like public interest before corporate interests, make it clear that we judge people not because of their religious beliefs, not because of their sexual orientation, not because of their gender, not because of their nationality, not because of their race, but we judge them by what they do and who they are and what they do. You can see the fire has died down. There are still branches that haven't burnt. And here I am, throwing those branches back onto the fire, trying to stoke, trying to restart this fire. And ultimately, whether this fire, whether this intolerance ends, depends on you. It depends on the individual. It depends on the individual having the capacity not to stereotype people. Once we begin to stereotype a particular section of this community, once we begin to listen to the dog whistling that is a constant feature of political debate in this country, once we give up our capacity to analyse situations and make our own decisions, once we start believing corporate propaganda, media propaganda and state propaganda, as we see currently now regarding the People's Republic of China, the thing is, every federal election we have a new group to target, a new group to denigrate, a new group we want the community to be fearful of. We've had the Islamic fundamentalists, we've had terrorists, we've had, Chinese expansionism, we've had the issues regarding race relations in this country. There's always a new fear that can be stoked. As I stoked what was left of that fire by throwing a few branches which hadn't been burnt onto that fire, governments and individuals can do the same and continue to do the same. They stoke the fires of division because it's those fires which create fear in the community, unfounded fear. And that unfounded fear is the lubricant that is used by governments to be re-elected. Whether it's the fundamentalist government in Iran, whether it's the theocracy, the Jewish fundamentalists in Israel, whether it's our own fundamentalists in this country, political fundamentalists who think the only economic solution is more deregulation, more privatisation, more globalisation, more corporatisation. This is the issue. We need to start thinking, and we need to have organisations in this country which are inclusive, not exclusive. Not an inclusivity which comes through legislation, but an inclusiveness which comes by our individual understanding that all human beings, irrespective of their gender, nationality, race, sexual orientation, nationality, are fundamentally similar.